My name is Sarah Roberts, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew everything about my family. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It all started when my great-aunt Margaret passed away at 92 in her sprawling Victorian house in Salem, Oregon. The funeral was small, just me, a few distant cousins I barely recognized, and her longtime neighbor, Mrs. Chen. Margaret had been the family historian, the keeper of our secrets, though I never imagined how dark those secrets truly were. The reading of the will took place in the dusty office of Hartwell and Associates, a law firm that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Brown wood paneling covered the walls, and the air smelled of old coffee and legal documents. I sat in a cracked leather chair, fidgeting with my purse strap, as Mr. Hartwell, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Miss Roberts," he began, his voice carrying the weight of formality, "your great-aunt has left you the entirety of her estate. The house, its contents," and he paused, consulting his notes. "A family safe that has been in the Roberts lineage for over a century." I remember feeling a mix of excitement and overwhelming responsibility. The house alone was worth at least $400,000, and I was drowning in student loans from my master's degree in social work. But there was something in Mr. Hartwell's tone that made me uneasy. "She left specific instructions," he continued, sliding a sealed envelope across the mahogany desk. "You're to read this only after you've opened the safe. The combination is written inside." The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained more than just paper and ink. Margaret's handwriting on the front was shaky but unmistakable. "For Sarah, when the truth can no longer be buried." 2 weeks later, I stood in Margaret's basement, staring at the massive steel safe embedded in the concrete wall. The basement itself was unsettling: low ceiling, exposed pipes, and a persistent dampness that made my skin crawl. The safe was old, probably from the 1920s, with an intricate dial lock and the Roberts family crest etched into the door. I'd been putting off this moment, telling myself I was too busy with the estate paperwork, but the truth was, I was scared. There was something about that envelope, about the way Margaret had insisted I wait to read it, that filled me with dread. The combination was written in Margaret's careful script, 152307. My hands trembled as I turned the dial, listening to the mechanical clicks echoing in the silent basement. When the final number clicked into place, I heard the heavy thunk of the locking mechanism disengaging. The safe door swung open with a groan that seemed to come from decades of secrets. Inside, the safe was larger than I'd expected, about the size of a small closet. Shelves lined the walls, filled with what looked like hundreds of small glass jars. Each jar was carefully labeled with dates spanning from 1923 to 1987, but it was the contents that made my blood run cold. Teeth, children's teeth, not the kind you'd expect from the tooth fairy. These were different. Some still had roots attached, as if they'd been forcibly removed. Others were stained with what looked like old blood. The jars were organized chronologically, and each label bore not just a date, but initials, and sometimes full names. Tommy Morrison, age 7, March 15th, 1923. Lucy Chen, age 6, September 2nd, 1934. Michael Rodriguez, age 8, November 18th, 1956. The names went on and on. 156 jars in total, 156 children. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sick joke, some elaborate hoax. But the teeth were real. The jars were real. The careful, methodical labeling was real. With shaking hands, I tore open Margaret's envelope. The letter inside was written on her personal stationery, the same cream-colored paper she'd used for birthday cards and Christmas notes throughout my childhood. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then the burden I have carried for 70 years is now yours. I pray you are stronger than I was. I pray you will do what I could not." The letter went on to explain that the Roberts family had been involved in something called the collection for over a century. It started with my great-great-grandfather, Edmund Roberts, who had been the town dentist in Salem in the early 1900s. According to Margaret, Edmund had developed an obsession with preserving what he called the essence of innocence. He believed, Margaret wrote, that children's teeth contained their pure souls, and that by collecting them, he could somehow preserve that innocence forever. What started as a disturbing hobby became something much darker. The letter detailed how Edmund had begun taking children, extracting their teeth while they were still alive, believing that the trauma and fear would somehow enhance the spiritual power he thought the teeth contained. When the children died from the procedures, and they always died, Edmund would dispose of their bodies in the vast forests surrounding Salem. Each generation of Robert's men continued the tradition, Margaret's letter continued. My father, your great-grandfather Charles, took over in the 1940s, then my brother Robert, your grandfather, in the 1960s. The last addition to the collection was made in 1987, when Robert finally died. I had to stop reading. The basement felt like it was spinning around me. My grandfather Robert had died when I was 5, but I remembered him as a kind, gentle man who gave me piggyback rides and told me stories about magical forests. The idea that this same man had been a child killer was impossible to process. But Margaret's letter wasn't finished. The most horrifying revelation was yet to come. The children were never random victims, Sarah. They were carefully chosen from families who wouldn't be believed if they reported their children missing. Immigrant families, the poor, children from broken homes. The Roberts family used their position in the community. Edmund as the town dentist, Charles as a city councilman, Robert as a police detective, to cover their tracks and discredit any investigations. My grandfather had been a police detective. He'd been the one investigating the disappearances of children he had killed. The sick irony of it made me physically ill. I ran upstairs and barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting. As I knelt on the cold tile floor, my mind raced with questions. How many families had spent decades wondering what happened to their children? How many parents had died, never knowing the truth? And then the most terrifying question of all, what was I supposed to do with this information? I spent the next 3 days in a haze, unable to eat or sleep. I kept thinking about those jars, about the careful labels, about the children whose names I now knew. I researched some of them online and found missing person reports, newspaper articles from decades past, families who had never stopped looking for answers. The Chen family had immigrated from China in 1933. Their 6-year-old daughter Lucy had disappeared while walking home from school. The article I found described how the family had begged the police to investigate, but their broken English and status as immigrants had made them easy to dismiss. Tommy Morrison had been the son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. When he vanished from a playground in 1923, the police had suggested he'd simply run away, despite his mother's insistence that he would never leave her. Michael Rodriguez's family had been migrant workers, following crop seasons throughout Oregon. When Michael disappeared, they'd been told by police that migrant children often got lost or were taken by other families looking for workers. No real investigation had ever been conducted. Each story was the same: vulnerable families dismissed by authorities, children who became statistics rather than priorities. On the 4th day, I forced myself to go back to the basement. I needed to understand the full scope of what my family had done. I needed to count every jar, document every name, prepare for what I knew I had to do. As I catalogued the collection, I noticed something that made my stomach turn even more. The dates weren't random. They followed a pattern. 1 child every 2 to 3 years, always in the spring or fall, always during times when families might be distracted by seasonal work or school transitions. But there was something else. Hidden behind the jars on the bottom shelf, I found a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and the pages were filled with my great-great-grandfather Edmund's meticulous handwriting. The journal was a detailed record of each abduction and murder. Edmund had documented everything: how he'd chosen each child, how he'd lured them away from safety, the procedures he'd performed, and his observations about their spiritual essence. The clinical detachment with which he described torturing and killing children was more disturbing than any horror movie I'd ever seen. But it was the final entry that made me understand the true scope of the horror. Written in 1987, in my grandfather Robert's handwriting, it read, "The collection is complete. 156 souls preserved for eternity. The tradition passes now to the next generation, should they prove worthy of the responsibility." The next generation. That was my father, but my father had died in a car accident when I was 12, long before he could have been inducted into this nightmare, which meant the responsibility had skipped a generation, which meant it had come to me. I slammed the journal shut and ran upstairs again, but this time I didn't stop at the bathroom. I ran outside into the cool Oregon evening, gasping for fresh air, trying to wash the taste of evil from my mouth. Mrs. Chen was watering her garden next door. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When she saw me stumbling out of the house, she immediately came over. "Sarah, dear, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." If only it were that simple. "Mrs. Chen," I managed to say, "how long have you lived next door?" "Oh, about 40 years now. I moved here with my late husband in 1983. Why do you ask?" 1. 4 years before the last entry in the journal. 4 years before my grandfather Robert had made his final addition to the collection. 1. 4 years before the last entry in the journal. 4 years before my grandfather Robert had made his final addition to the collection. "Did you know my family well, my grandfather Robert?" Mrs. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "Your grandfather was always very polite, very helpful, though..." She paused as if deciding whether to continue. "There were always rumors about the Roberts family. Nothing specific. Just whispers about how children seemed to disappear whenever they were around. But people said a lot of things back then that weren't true." "What kind of things?" "Well, there was talk about your great-grandfather Charles being involved in some missing children cases back in the 50s. And your grandfather Robert being a detective, he was always working on cases involving missing kids. Some people thought it was strange how many of those cases went unsolved." She shook her head. "But I never believed the gossip. Your family always seemed so normal, so respectable." Normal, respectable. The perfect cover for monsters. That night I sat in Margaret's living room, surrounded by family photos and antiques, trying to decide what to do. I could destroy the evidence, burn the journal, smash the jars, and pretend I'd never found any of it. I could sell the house and move far away, leaving the past buried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those names on the jars. Tommy Morrison, Lucy Chen, Michael Rodriguez. 156 children who deserved justice, even if it came 70 years too late. I thought about their families, about parents who had died, never knowing what happened to their babies. I thought about siblings who had spent their entire lives wondering if their brother or sister was still alive somewhere. I thought about the communities that had been terrorized by these disappearances, never knowing that the monster lived among them, protected by badge and social standing. The next morning, I called the Salem Police Department. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. "Salem Police, this is Officer Martinez. I need to report a crime. Multiple crimes, murders." "Ma'am, when did these murders occur?" "Between 1923 and 1987. There was a long pause. "Ma'am, are you reporting historical crimes?" "Yes. I have evidence, physical evidence. I know where the bodies are buried." Another pause. "Ma'am, I'm going to transfer you to Detective Williams. Please hold." Detective Williams had a calm, professional voice that reminded me painfully of how my grandfather Robert might have sounded when he was dismissing the families of his victims. But I had to trust someone, and the police were the only ones with the authority to properly investigate. "Miss Roberts, I understand you have information about historical murders. My family killed children for over 60 years. They abducted and murdered children in Salem. I have physical evidence, and I know the location of the burial sites." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought the call had been disconnected. "Miss Roberts, These are very serious allegations. I'm going to need you to come to the station to make a formal statement, and I'll need to see this evidence you mentioned. 2 hours later, I sat in a sterile interview room at the Salem Police Department. The leather journal and photographs of the jar collection spread across a metal table. Detective Williams was a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Across from her sat Detective Park, a younger Asian man who was taking detailed notes. "Miss Roberts," Detective Williams began, "before we proceed, I need to make sure you understand the implications of what you're telling us. You're alleging that your family members committed serial murder over a span of more than 60 years. I know how it sounds, but the evidence is all there. The journal documents everything. Names, dates, locations. The teeth are physical proof. And I think I know where the bodies are buried." Detective Park looked up from his notes. "You mentioned burial sites. How do you know where they are?" I opened the journal to a page near the back where Edmund had drawn a crude map of the forest area behind the Roberts property. "My great-great-grandfather documented everything. He was obsessed with preserving what he called the complete record. The map shows where each child was buried." Detective Williams studied the map, her expression growing more serious. "This area, it's now part of Silver Falls State Park. If there are bodies there, we're talking about a massive excavation operation. I understand, but these families deserve to know what happened to their children, even if it's been 70 years. The interview continued for 3 more hours. I told them everything. About Margaret's letter, about the family tradition, about the pattern of choosing vulnerable victims. I explained how the Roberts family had used their positions of authority to cover their tracks and discredit investigations. When it was over, Detective Williams leaned back in her chair. "Miss Roberts, I have to ask, why are you coming forward with this? You could have destroyed the evidence and no one would ever have known." It was a question I'd been asking myself since the moment I opened that safe. Because those children deserve justice, because their families deserve answers, and because I paused, struggling to find the words. Because I can't live with being part of a family that built its legacy on the bones of innocent children. Even if I wasn't directly involved, even if I didn't know, I can't let it continue to be buried. Detective Williams nodded slowly. "We'll need to verify everything you've told us. The forensics team will examine the teeth, we'll research the missing person cases, and if everything checks out, we'll begin excavation of the burial sites. But I want you to understand, this investigation could take years, and it's going to attract a lot of media attention. Your family name is going to be associated with these crimes forever." "I know, but it should be. What they did was monstrous, and the world should know." The next few weeks passed in a blur of police interviews, forensic examinations, and media frenzy. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Oregon woman uncovers family's century-long murder spree. By evening, news vans lined the street outside Margaret's house, and reporters were calling my phone every few minutes. The forensic examination of the teeth confirmed what I already knew. They belonged to children, and many showed signs of having been forcibly extracted. DNA testing was more challenging due to the age of the samples, but the forensics team was confident they could match some of the teeth to missing person cases. The excavation of the burial sites began 3 weeks after my initial report. I wasn't allowed on the scene, but I watched the news coverage obsessively. Ground-penetrating radar had identified multiple anomalies in the forest area marked on Edmund's map. The first body was found on a grey October morning, exactly where the map indicated it would be. It was Tommy Morrison. Dental records confirmed his identity within days. He'd been 7 years old when he disappeared in 1923, and his remains showed evidence of the brutal dental procedures described in Edmund's journal. The discovery of Tommy's body opened the floodgates. Over the next 6 months, investigators recovered the remains of 43 children from the burial sites. Each discovery was a vindication of my decision to come forward, but also a fresh wound in my soul. I attended every press conference, every update from the police. I felt I owed it to the victims to bear witness to their stories being told. The media attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside my apartment, photographers followed me to work, and my phone rang constantly with interview requests. but the hardest part was meeting the families. Mrs. Chen approached me after one of the press conferences. I recognized her immediately, though she looked older, more fragile than when I'd seen her watering her garden. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to thank you." I was confused. "Thank me, Mrs. Chen? I don't understand." Lucy Chen was my aunt, my father's sister. She disappeared in 1934 when my father was just 12 years old. Our family spent decades wondering what happened to her, wondering if she was still alive somewhere. My father died 5 years ago, still hoping he might see her again someday. The weight of her words hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Chen had been living next door to the family that had murdered her aunt for 40 years, never knowing the truth. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry for what my family did." She took my hands in hers, and I was surprised by how warm they were. "You didn't do this, dear. You're the one who brought the truth to light. You're the one who gave Lucy back to our family so we can finally lay her to rest properly." Similar encounters happened again and again over the following months. Descendants of victims would approach me at press conferences or contact me through the police. Each conversation was heartbreaking and healing at the same time. There was Maria Rodriguez, Michael's younger sister, who was now in her 70s. She told me how her family had been forced to leave Oregon after Michael's disappearance because the police had made it clear they weren't welcome to keep asking questions. There was James Morrison, Tommy's nephew, who had become a private investigator specifically to search for missing children, inspired by his family's loss. There was David Chen, Lucy's great-nephew, who had spent years researching his family's immigration history and had always wondered about the aunt who had simply vanished from the family records. Each family had been shaped by the loss, by the not knowing, by the decades of wondering and hoping and grieving without closure. My family had stolen more than just children's lives. They had stolen the peace of mind of entire families for generations. The investigation also revealed the extent of the cover-up. Police records from the 1920s through the 1980s showed a clear pattern of dismissed reports, inadequate investigations, and evidence that had mysteriously disappeared. My family hadn't just been killers. They had been protected killers, shielded by their positions in the community and the prejudices of their time. Detective Williams kept me updated on the progress of the investigation. The remains of 156 children were eventually recovered, matching exactly the number of jars in the safe. Each child had been buried with a small metal tag bearing their initials and the date of their death. Edmund's final act of meticulous record-keeping. The psychological profile developed by the FBI painted a picture of a family consumed by a shared delusion. Edmund Roberts had genuinely believed that he was preserving something sacred by collecting children's teeth, and he had passed this belief down to his son and grandson like a twisted family tradition. What's particularly disturbing, Dr. Sarah Martinez, the FBI's behavioral analyst, explained to me during one of our interviews, is how they managed to maintain normal family lives while committing these atrocities. Your grandfather, Robert, was by all accounts a loving father and husband. He coached Little League Baseball, attended church regularly, and was respected in the community. The compartmentalization required to live such a double life suggests a level of psychological sophistication that's truly chilling. The trial preparations took over a year, even though all the perpetrators were dead. The state decided to pursue a formal legal process to officially close the cases and provide legal recognition for the victims' families. I testified for 3 days, walking the court through everything I had discovered, everything I had learned about my family's crimes. The hardest part was reading aloud from Edmund's journal. The courtroom was packed with family members of the victims, and I could hear people crying as I recited his clinical descriptions of torture and murder. But I forced myself to continue, to give voice to the children who had been silenced. When it was over, the judge made a statement that I'll never forget. While we cannot bring these children back, while we cannot undo the decades of pain their families have endured, we can ensure that their stories are told, their lives are remembered, and their deaths are officially recognized. Miss Roberts, your courage in coming forward has given these families something they have waited generations to receive: the truth. The memorial service was held on a sunny Saturday in May, exactly 2 years after I'd first opened the safe. The city of Salem had created a memorial garden in Silver Falls State Park, near where many of the children had been found. Each child had a small stone marker with their name, their age, and the dates of their birth and death. 156 stones in neat rows, surrounded by flowers and trees, with a larger memorial stone in the center that read, "In memory of the children taken too soon, your lives mattered, your stories will not be forgotten." I stood at the back of the crowd, watching as family members placed flowers on the graves of children they had never been able to properly mourn. Mrs. Chen knelt beside Lucy's marker, speaking softly in what I assumed was Chinese. Maria Rodriguez sat in her wheelchair next to Michael's stone, her weathered hands tracing his name carved in granite. After the formal ceremony ended, I walked through the memorial garden alone. Each stone represented not just a child, but a family destroyed, a community terrorized, a life cut short by the monsters who shared my blood. At Tommy Morrison's grave, I found a small toy truck, probably left by one of his surviving relatives. At Lucy Chen's marker, someone had placed a small bouquet of jasmine flowers. At Michael Rodriguez's stone, there was a handwritten note in Spanish that I couldn't read, but the love in the careful handwriting was universal. As I stood there among the graves of my family's victims, I made a promise. I would spend the rest of my life working to help other families find missing children. I would use my social work degree to advocate for the vulnerable, the overlooked, the dismissed. I would make sure that what happened to these 156 children could never happen again. The Roberts family legacy would no longer be one of horror and secrecy. It would be one of truth, justice, and redemption. 3 months later, I sold Margaret's house and used the money to establish the Roberts Foundation for Missing Children. We work with law enforcement agencies to ensure that missing children cases receive proper attention regardless of the family's social status, immigration status, or economic situation. We provide resources for families navigating the nightmare of a missing child, and we fund cold case investigations for children who disappeared decades ago. The Foundation's first success came 8 months after we opened. We helped solve the case of Maria Santos, a 6-year-old girl who had disappeared from Portland in 1995. Her case had been largely ignored because her family were undocumented immigrants who were afraid to push too hard with the police. Our investigators found evidence that led to the arrest and conviction of her killer, finally giving her family the closure they had sought for 28 years. I still live with the weight of what I discovered in that basement. I still have nightmares about those jars, about Edmund's journal, about the children who died in terror and pain. But I also live with the knowledge that I did the right thing. I chose truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty, and the needs of the victims over my own desire to pretend none of it had ever happened. The last entry in Edmund's journal had said that the tradition would pass to the next generation if they proved worthy of the responsibility. He was right about the responsibility passing to me, but he was wrong about what that responsibility entailed. My responsibility wasn't to continue the collection, it was to end it. It was to make sure the truth came to light, no matter how painful. It was to give voice to the voiceless and justice to the forgotten. The Roberts family tradition of murder and secrecy died with me, but a new tradition began, one of advocacy, truth-telling, and fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. Every morning when I wake up, I think about those 156 children. I think about Tommy Morrison and his toy truck, about Lucy Chen and her jasmine flowers, about Michael Rodriguez and the note written in Spanish by someone who loved him. I think about all the children whose names I now know, whose stories I helped bring to light. And I remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is open a door that was meant to stay closed, even when you know that what you find inside will change everything forever. The safe is empty now. The jars have been destroyed, the teeth returned to their rightful graves. The journal entered into evidence and locked away in police storage. But the memory of what was hidden there will stay with me always, not as a burden, but as a reminder of why the truth matters, no matter how terrible it might be. Because in the end, the truth is the only thing that can set us free. The truth is the only thing that can bring justice to the dead and peace to the living. And sometimes the truth is the only thing that can transform a legacy of evil into a force for good. I am Sarah Roberts, and I inherited more than just a safe full of secrets. I inherited the responsibility to make sure that those secrets could never hurt anyone ever again. And that's exactly what I did.